Okay, so last time we actually got through quite a lot of work on this one. I finished off all the sanding around the perimeter of the body, which has all gone very nicely, and we got pretty much all of the routing done for pickup cavities, etc. And I thought I'd done with all that and it was time to move on and get the routing done for the binding. However, there's been a development and I've realised that there is a little bit more to do. Some of you might remember I recently did a refinish on a Stratocaster, turned it from Sunburst into Fiesta Red, did a little bit of relicing, a little bit controversial. My friend who I did the job for has been away on holiday for a little while, so he's only just been and picked it up. And even though I said I didn't really want anything for doing the job, that didn't really sit very well with him. So having seen that I was going to put a humbucker in the neck position of this build, he's actually been out and bought me a Tone Rider AC2B, which is an Alnico 2 Classic, so a late 50s voice bridge humbucker. And I've heard some nice things about these Alnico 2 humbuckers. However, now I have it, I can see I'm probably not quite deep enough with my routing. Now I could just put some deepening routes in on these little ear sections just to drop the legs of the pickup into, but I figure if I'm going to get the router out, I might as well just deepen the whole thing by a few millimeters. And that's sitting about 8mm proud of the top of the body. We're going to have 3mm-ish of scratch plate on there. The pickup will want to be a little bit proud of the scratch plate, so I reckon if I take another 4 to 5mm out of the bottom of there, we should be where we need to be then. So that's one thing we need to do. One thing we don't need to do is put the output jack hole in. I can't do that just yet because I'm going to be running a bearing guided cut around both the top and the back of this guitar, and if I've got that great big hole there, there's a chance that that guide bearing is going to go into that hole and I'll take out a chunk of my body, which we absolutely don't want. So I have to wait until after we've done the binding to put that in. And of course we still have this little area here where we put that filler in that needs tidying up before we can go any further, but that has dried absolutely solid now. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is I'll just get this pickup route sorted out very quickly, then I can get that filler rubbed down and then we can break the router out again and start to get the channels cut for the binding. And today, for all the routing that I'm going to be doing, I'm actually going to be using the smaller Katsu router, mainly because I don't need the power for the little jobs that I'm doing, but also it's a little bit easier to control being smaller. And that's a much better fit now, so we can put the pickup back away and not have to worry about that for a little while longer. Now, one thing I'm not going to do, which I did actually do on my first build, was to do a string through configuration. So that's drill all the way through the body and put some ferrules on the back. I'm not doing that for two reasons. Firstly, I don't have access to my drill press, which makes that job an awful lot easier. Getting the ferrules on the back lined up nicely is a very, very difficult job to do, even if you do have the right tools on hand. And secondly, since my first build, I've built a few thin lines that I've done top mounting on. So these bridges, you can either go string through, as you can see there, they've got holes, strings go through, or you can top mount because they've got string holes on the back as well. And I've discovered that I actually prefer the feel of a top mounted Telecaster. To me, it just feels nicer, feels like they're a little bit softer to play, if that makes sense. That of course could be utter bullshit and there's no difference whatsoever in string tension, I don't know, but that's the way I prefer them. So that's one job we don't have to worry about, thankfully. So moving on, I'm now going to just sort out this little bit of filler in here and we can start looking at the binding. Now normally when I'm cutting binding channels, I use this cutter from Radian. It's a 3-flute one, which is better than 2 flutes by a factor of 1. And it's got a bearing on, well, I've got various sizes of those. Obviously this is the one that will give me a 1.5mm depth of cut, which is the thickness of the binding I'm going to use. However, I didn't have this for my first build. It was an expensive tool. I believe it was around about the £50 mark for that set. But worth the money because it does a great job. What I did have was a standard 2-flute bearing guided cutter. It's a 1/2-inch cutter and it came with a 1/2-inch bearing on, but I've taken that off and replaced it with these 9mm bearings. So 1/2-inch, 12mm-ish. If you take away 9mm from 12mm, you're left with 3mm, half that, 1.5. That will give me the perfect cut for my binding. It's not as good as the other cutter, so you have to just be a little bit more careful with it, but it will do the job perfectly adequately. This one is quite new as well, so it is still quite sharp. So on this soft pine, I really shouldn't see this being a problem at all. So we'll get this set up and we'll start to get this top channel done. Okay, so we're set up. What I've done is I've kind of used this trend jig just to set up and make sure I'm 6mm from the base to the end of the cutting edge. And we can slowly start working our way around. Now, the only thing you really have to watch for here is that you're kind of keeping the base firmly pushed down and keeping everything at 90 degrees. And what I probably should be doing is putting the big Perspex extended base that I've got for the router on, but I've put it down somewhere and I'm totally clueless as to where that somewhere is, so we're just going to have to do it without it and be careful. Okay, and that's the top done, and it seems to have gone very, very nicely. Well happy with that. The only kind of little bits are on these edges on the neck pocket. It just trims it down so it's so thin that there's nothing supporting it and it comes away, but that's okay because we need to kind of round these off a little bit anyway, so all that will kind of sort itself out as we go through. I'm going to leave that rounding off process though until I've stuck in the binding, because that will help support everything and just make that process a lot easier. Okay, so turn it over and do exactly the same thing on the back. Okay, and there's the binding channels cut, and they cut very, very nicely. I was really happy with the way that they went. You might have noticed as well that I was partaking in a lot of downhill routing, and what I mean by that is you start at the high points and you work your way down, because what that means is, particularly kind of in these areas, your router's going that way, it would flick up this grain and just tear chunks out. So if you route this way, it's much less likely to do that. And as you can see, taking it nice and steady, we've got a nice clean route without any damage. You're only taking off 1.5 mil, so if you do it right, you shouldn't have any issues. So that out of the way, we can move on to the next step, which is getting the binding ready for sticking in. Now, on most of this body, I would say everything past there, it's very nice, kind of gentle curves, and the binding will go around those no problem whatsoever. It will even, at a push, go around this horn and into this corner, but it will be kind of slightly more difficult. So we're going to have to do a little bit of preforming on the top. However, on the back is a completely different story, because obviously we've got this heel area to bind, and there's a lot of very tight kind of bends in there. Now, I've done a little bit of research to see how Fender did it, and I was hoping for some cheeky little miters on these corners, and then I could get away with doing the same, because anything Leo does must be right. However, what I discovered was that Fender appeared to go around this whole thing in one go and put a join right at the butt of the guitar body, which in one way is great because it means I'll be able to get a much neater job on this kind of heel area. But in another way it's bad, because that means I'm going to have to figure out a way of doing it. So I've had a little bit of a practice run, and it involves a heat gun and a little bit of judicious pre-bending, but I have managed to get something that's kind of probably close enough. There's a couple of little gaps when I hold it in position like that, but when I get it all kind of clamped in with some heavy duty masking tape and get this stuck in position, we should be able to get round in one go. So in theory we should be able to do this. So now it's a case of actually doing it in practice. And I think as much as anything, the challenge here is actually going to be kind of filming this without being totally in the way of both cameras at all times. But we'll just have to see what we can achieve. And I think the key to this is applying the heat gently and evenly, and just slowly but surely adding the bend. I think if I can take that bit on, get a little bit on the bottom. I think we're pretty much there on that bit. There is a tiny little bit of a gap, but we can kind of pull that in when we're actually sticking it down properly. So I think from there we'll start working our way around the rest of this. And now we can start working this other side down. I've got a little trick up my sleeve here as well, as much as I'm going to just put this socket in position. It's a 15mm socket. I'm just going to clamp that roughly in position like that. And I'm going to heat up the socket a little bit. Hopefully that will put a bit of heat into that binding, and I'll just leave that for about 10 or 15 minutes so it's all nicely cooled off, and we can get it off and see how we've done. Okay, so the rest of it just kind of taped on without any help at all. So I'm just going to take this clamp off. Hopefully that's had enough time to cool down and harden up again. And looking at that, that looks absolutely spot on. I don't think we'll have any trouble at all getting this to stick in position. I'll bring you in closer and we can have a look at this. And hopefully you can see there are some little minor gaps, but with a slight bit of pressure on, they all close up. And what you need to remember as well is once we get the acetone onto this, which we're going to use to stick it in position, this binding will soften up a little bit more as well, making it just that touch more pliable, meaning we can get it to sit right in as we want it to. So far, so good. Which means we just need to get this turned over, break out another piece of binding. Now this one is going to be relatively straightforward for most parts. Virtually all of this we can just do with a few bits of tape. Trim that down a bit. We've actually gone round that horn okay. So I think it's just this little bit here that might benefit from a little bit of heat. Like that. So that's all gone in really nicely on there. Like I say, there's a few little gaps, but they'll pull in once we actually get to doing this properly. However, putting this binding on is quite a long and involved process, so I haven't really got time to fit that into this episode, so that's going to be for the next one. But I'm happy to say what could have been a fraught experience of getting these channels cut, and especially getting that bit of binding to go around the back of there has actually gone really, really well. So I'm very happy with that. Hopefully that's a good omen for next time and we can get this binding installed without any problem whatsoever. So I'll be back in a couple of days' time when we'll do that. Until then, Don't forget to hit that like button if you've enjoyed this. Subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.